Helter Skelter. Two words that defined one of the darkest and most infamous chapters in American criminal history. Two words that sold millions of books, shaped a sensational trial, and convinced the world it understood exactly what the Manson family was and why they killed. For nearly 6 decades, that has been the accepted narrative. And for a long time, I believed it too. Then I started asking different questions. I spent 3 years researching and writing my book, The Manson Family, More to the Story, because I believed the real truth was buried underneath that narrative. I discovered that before the verdicts, before the trials, before the arrests in Death Valley, and long before the killings in the summer swelter of 1969, they were just young people in a turbulent era. Seekers, drifters, believers, drawn towards something that felt, in those early days, like the most beautiful thing they'd ever experienced. This podcast is that story. One spring day, after a morning at the beach, Pat and Ella were hitchhiking on the Sunset Strip. Along came a nice car driven by a rugged, good-looking guy. He pulled up and invited the women in, who said they were going to Topanga Canyon. He asked them, "Before I drop you off, would you like to come by my house for a visit?" They nodded as the young man drove to an upscale home in the Pacific Palisades. The three sat together in the kitchen, eating cookies with milk, then went to his bedroom and had sex. Finally, he introduced himself. His name was Dennis Wilson, and he was the drummer for the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys were arguably the most popular American band of the 1960s. Dennis, the only actual surfer in the quintet, was inspiration for their bitchin' looks and attitude. Since their first hit, 1961's Surfin', they'd seen their star rise and rise, only to falter in recent years. By 1968, the Beach Boys were having an identity crisis. They tried reinventing themselves on their past 2 albums, but now their lead singer, Wilson's brother Brian, was in the early stages of a drug-fueled mental breakdown. And the band's next album, Friends, released that summer, would hit no higher than number 126 on the charts. Dennis was sick of feeling like a rusty wheel in his band, comprised of his brothers Brian and Carl, his cousin Mike Love, and friend Al Jardine. The other Beach Boys considered Dennis flighty and distracting. True, his drumming skills were never top-notch, but he was feeling resentful. That year, Dennis had separated from his wife, Carol. He missed his daughter and adopted son. He had many friends, but trouble maintaining long-lasting relationships. He was deeply, disturbingly resentful of his abusive father, Murray. He turned first to transcendental meditation, then to drugs to deal with his anger. The drugs and chronic infidelity led to the dissolution of his marriage. The Beach Boys spent several months touring that spring with Buffalo Springfield, but following the assassination of Martin Luther King, suspended the tour. Dennis needed a full work schedule, else his idle hands usually got into some kind of mayhem. That season, he was quite the man about town, along with pals Greg Jacobson and Terry Melcher. The trio were known as the Golden Penetrators for their sexual proclivities. Dennis also felt guilty about his wealth, that he didn't deserve it. He was generous to a fault with friends. He didn't know it at the time, but these 2 hitchhikers ultimately cost him over $100,000, a totaled sports car, the decision to flee his own home in terror, and years of shame when he realized he supported one of the most deranged and dangerous men the country had ever known. But that day, good old Dennis was just happy to pick up two gals for some afternoon delight. Likely he had done this dozens of times. Dennis lived at 14400 Sunset Boulevard at a little bend in the road. Sitting on 3 rolling acres, the luxurious log cabin home was near Will Rogers Park and had once been owned by the cowboy philosopher and actor. The house, designed to look like a hunting lodge, boasted a wraparound porch, and the interior featured a massive stone fireplace. Dennis also had a swimming pool, a guest house, and several vehicles, including a red Ferrari, to enjoy. After an hour romping in the sack, Dennis excused himself. He had to go to a recording session, but told the women they could let themselves out when they were ready. When he returned home around 3 a.m., Dennis discovered a black school bus parked in the driveway and lights on in his house. He cautiously opened the door and was greeted by Charles Manson. Charlie was grinning like a lunatic. Dennis took a step back and asked if he planned to hurt him. Charlie quickly assured the famous drummer that he didn't mean him any harm. He demonstrated his benevolence by getting down on his knees and kissing Wilson's feet. Inside his house, Dennis found a dozen people partying, mostly female. Pat and Ella rushed over to introduce him to Charlie, who clearly already knew who the occupant of the home was. Manson then gently nudged a few girls to take their host to bed. Dennis had his eye on one particular girl, 17-year-old Nancy Brenda Pittman. Like Dennis, Brenda was a surfer. Brenda had thoroughly shed her well-heeled past and was game for anything. The next morning, with the group crashed throughout Dennis's home, he and Charlie started talking. Charlie laid his usual line of sage wisdom and total bullshit on the drummer. Before long, Dennis was referring to Manson as the Wizard. He bought into it, Charlie's whole rap, his philosophy. This was what Dennis was looking for. And when he heard Charlie play his music, he vowed to make something happen for his houseguest. The first person Dennis called was his buddy Greg Jacobson, one of his fellow Golden Penetrators. Jacobson, a talent scout, knew many movie stars and musicians. Like Dennis, Greg liked what he heard from Manson and assured him that he would help him secure a record deal. To be fair, Manson was a good guitarist, a gifted songwriter. His lyrics seem quite dated today, but at the time, he seemed to presage the singer-songwriter era looming ahead. Musicians like Cat Stevens, Joni Mitchell, and Harry Chapin were just launching their careers in 1968. Manson might very well have found himself on the cusp of this generation of performers who wrote their own music. He probably never had what it took to be a big star, but he certainly could have found fame and success in the music industry if things hadn't gotten so stabby. Charlie later tried to debunk the helter-skelter motive, claiming he was of the Sinatra generation, not the Beatles. But the Beatles represented the two things he did not and could not have: fame and youth. The Beach Boys were the American Beatles, or had been in their heyday. And Dennis was exactly what Charlie wished he could have been: young, carefree, handsome, and adored. Jacobson, also split from his wife, Carol Costello, daughter of famed comic Lou, really appreciated Manson's girls, particularly Ruth Ann Morehouse. Ruth Ann ditched the husband she swindled into marrying a few months before and joined them that spring while they were staying at Wilson's. When Ruth Ann arrived, Manson whisked her into Dennis's bedroom for sex. The teen was turned off when Charlie also invited Lynette to join them, but she didn't say no. Over the next few months, the dark-haired adolescent found herself the object of many men's attentions and was often used as Charlie's pawn. He would lure a man with the promise of sex with lovely Ruth Ann, getting them to agree to him, or he'd withhold Ruth Ann until he got what he wanted from one of her many admirers. Manson made sure that the scout got plenty of time with Ruth Ann. He groomed her to whisper sweet nothings, focused on Charlie's talents, while she serviced Jacobson. The second call Dennis made on Charlie's behalf was to his fellow Beach Boys. In 1967, the Beach Boys created their own record label, Brother Records, and Brian Wilson built a studio in his home. Dennis brought Manson to the studio to perform a few songs for his bandmates. One of Manson's fatal flaws was that just when he was presented with an opportunity to shine, he usually blew it. He'd get the jitters and say really inappropriate things. Brian Wilson, the brooding genius of pet sounds, didn't dig the wizard at all. Dennis believed in Charlie, though, and promised he'd help make something happen. Maybe Manson could write a song for the Beach Boys to record. Meanwhile, Wilson virtually turned over his beautiful home to Manson's people. Girls were lounging by the pool, strange men were showing up, drugs were everywhere, and there were orgies, many, many orgies. Anytime one of Dennis's Hollywood friends visited, the girls would drop their clothing to deliberately freak them out. Dennis even let the women take his Rolls Royce dumpster diving. The women would forage in garbage bins behind supermarkets and restaurants, scavenging browning lettuces and droopy carrots, and bring them back to Wilson's house for their vegetarian feasts. Brenda also sewed all of Dennis's satin sheets into harem outfits. His housekeeper was really upset about that. Dennis kept up his cheerleading for Manson, inviting friends like Neil Young to meet the singer. Young liked Manson so much he once gave him a motorcycle. The Harvest Moon artist wrote in his autobiography, Waging Heavy Peace, about a gathering at Wilson's. A guy showed up, picked up my guitar, and started playing a lot of songs on it. His name was Charlie. His songs were off-the-cuff things he made up as he went along, and they were never the same twice in a row. Kind of like Dylan, but different because it was hard to glimpse a true message in them, but the songs were fascinating. He was quite good. Charlie was also introduced to Frank Zappa. Zappa's wife, who met Charlie and the women, said that anyone she knew who wasn't completely drugged out always got a bad vibe from them. Manson needed his acolytes around when he performed, especially in the studio. They were a package deal. In fact, it was Greg Jacobson who first suggested the name The Family Jams as a band name, and thus the moniker The Manson Family was created. Jacobson understood that Manson and his devotees seemed like family. A super weird family with a penchant for knives and group gropes, but a family nonetheless. In return, the gals called Jacobson Angel. Charlie didn't refer to his followers as family, but others did. Manson was right in one sense that there was no family. He never saw those people as kin, and wasn't comfortable being responsible for them. Music was not just Manson's primary focus, and his songs weren't happy little ditties. They expressly conveyed his philosophies.
Those who have written about Manson have implied that drugs and sex were his primary means of programming the family,
wrote Paul Watkins in his 1979 memoir, My Life with Charles Manson, published by Bantam Books.
But music was perhaps even more influential.
Finally, Manson was in the kind of music circles he had dreamed about. Fame and fortune surrounded him, plus great talent and generosity. But the big prize, Charlie knew, was a record deal, and the man to make that happen was Terry Melcher. Melcher, the son of movie star Doris Day, was a producer for Columbia Records. He had taken local bands, the Byrds and Paul Revere and the Raiders, and turned them into megastars. He began this journey when he was just 23 and went on to produce more than 80 hit songs for Columbia. Dennis invited Melcher to come see the wizard. Melcher was a different kind of dude, though. He might indulge in a little hanky-panky with the girls. He, too, was fond of Ruth Ann, even tried to hire her as his maid. But he was aloof and reserved. Terry knew that he was a hot ticket and wanted to preserve his reputation by working with only the best. And as the son of a well-known actress, he also recognized the kind of sycophants that gravitated to people like him. That summer, Melcher was living with model Candace Bergen, renting a home in the prestigious Benedict Canyon area of Bel Air. Melcher would visit Dennis's pad and have some fun with Charlie and the women, but he never seemed to have time to listen to Manson perform. A few times, Manson tagged along with Dennis and Greg on their way to Melcher's home at 10050 Cielo Drive. The man who could fulfill his dreams, Charlie knew, lived in that luxury hillside home. That summer, Melcher was in talks with Dennis and producer Lou Adler to start a film company. Adler had worked with Janis Joplin, the Mamas and the Papas, and produced the award-winning film of the Monterey Pop Festival. Clearly, for all three of the Golden Penetrators, great things were on the horizon, and Manson wanted to be sure he was along for the ride. Thank you for listening to the Manson Family, More to the Story. In this podcast, we focus on peeling back the layers, one chapter at a time, in order to demystify the family and destroy the myths that leave us in the stone-cold dark. In our next episode, The Wizard, we spend time with two deeply wounded men who found in each other something genuine. Dennis Wilson, a restless and generous soul drowning in fame he couldn't quite believe he deserved, and Charles Manson, an unknown man who felt destined for fame and was finally tantalizingly close to it. It is one of the great, painful what-ifs of this entire story. Two men who genuinely inspired each other on a collision course with the worst versions of themselves. What might their lives have looked like if they had simply been allowed to make music together? This is H. Allegra Lansing. The story of the family and the murders of 1969 have always been more than a crime story. This is a human story, and there is an imperative to understand it, because the vulnerabilities that drew those young people into darkness are not unique to them. They belong to all of us. This podcast series is drawn from my book, The Manson Family, More to the Story, published by Story Stratosphere, and is based on historical records, contemporary reporting, and archival research. Citations for this episode can be found in the show notes. All writing and most narration by yours truly. Theme music is Masked by Silent Partner, with additional scoring from Echoes of Time by Kevin MacLeod.